Thank you for joining today's webinar being led by Dr. Kazempour from Amarex, an NSF international company. Amarex is a full-service CRO and has worked on over 100 clinical trial projects around the globe. Today we will discuss points to consider for trial designs in general and adaptive trials in particular. Please refer all questions to the chat section of the application located on the right-hand side of your screen. Thank you, and now over to Dr. Kazempour.
Good morning or good afternoon, depends where you are. This is Kazempour, and I am pleased to present to you this topics concerning clinical trial design as a whole and adaptive trial design in particular. We chose this topic with respect to adaptive trial design in particular because especially now that we are in COVID era, really, although adaptive trial design has been around for a long time, I would say more than 10 years now, or at least FDA, Food and Drug Administration here in the US, accept adaptive trial design for a long time, but the guidelines first time came out, I think in February 2010. However, some company, including Amarex, was submitting adaptive trial designs earlier than that. The concept has been around for a long time, but the guidelines that FDA accepting it came out a bit late. And the latest version of the guideline came out, I think, in 2019. But anyway, I thought first to tell you about trial design as a whole, because although I'm sure you have used and you have conducted clinical trial, but some of the terminology may not be familiar. And I am going to only focus on few of the issues of clinical trial design. I partitioned it into two parts. As you can see, the agenda is before study design and after study design. I use the word adaptive trial design as part of the after. And for the before study design, I am focusing on few components that are essential when some is thinking of doing a clinical trial. One is physician focus group input. The other one is taking advantage and learning and using key opinion leaders' thoughts. And then the next is selecting endpoints, endpoints being the primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, and so on. They are essential. You will see that I will talk about them a lot because depends where you are in your trial. Obviously, when we are talking about adaptive trial design, we are focusing on the, you may call them phase 3 trials or confirmatory trials. And, still, the concept of endpoint is very, very essential, and I will tell you why that is the case in more detail. And then I added one more component here, and that is IP management and distribution. That's the investigational product. When you are doing a clinical trial, you are distributing the IP to having it in a depot, and then from depot to clinical sites, or somehow you have to distribute the clinical product, the investigational product, to the sites. And that one, in adaptive trial design in particular, is a bit tricky. I will talk about it in more detail later and see why it's a little bit tricky compared to when it is not adaptive clinical trial. So I will talk about that one with a bit more detail later. That is the concept for before study design. And the concept for after study design, I am focusing on, again, some component that I do believe they are important. There are so many other components really that are important, but I decided to focus on these, and then I'll be more than happy if any question comes up, I can address those questions about the other part of a study design that maybe in some cases as important as the topics that I chose. So how many sites we need to have, and how we are choosing the sites. This is one topic that we'll cover under after study design, although the focus is going to be adaptive, but those are the things that I like to cover. Patient recruitment plan, that's another component that I like to talk about. And then the main component, which is the adaptive trial design. And what are the benefits of it? What are the advantages of it? What are the disadvantages of it? Why and why not? And what can we adopt? What can we not make any changes? Those are the details that you will see, and the risk and benefit. And then at the end, I will summarize what I say. Let's focus on the before study design topics. Physician focus group input. The physician focus group really typically it is used when we have an approved product. Then we go and find physicians and then present the product, the medical product, the clinical, the drug or the devices, medical device that we have, and try to get their input and try to find a way to best present it. No, in this case, I am not talking about post-approval physician focus group. We, Amarex, has conducted quite large number of physician focus group, both for before approval and post-approval. The focus at the moment is before approval. The focus group or the physician really is the end user, the clinician who will use the product. That's what we have in mind. If you have another beta blocker or another anti-infective, you may want to talk to the end users and find out what the new product to be better than the one that they are using, what characteristics you need, and then try to take advantage of the knowledge that you have when you are doing your clinical trial. Try to incorporate those components in your clinical trial. I know the way that everybody is focusing on approval, therefore no one cares about the end users. Because the end users may be investigators, may not be investigators. Typically, when we go with the principal investigator, go to clinical sites, and we choose investigators, they are clinical trialists, or they may have been end users, but they are not really as the focus group that we are going to use. They are either academicians or the sites that mostly do clinical trial. So they may be end users. There are several. When we are doing sites that they are very, very small, they are end users. But doing a professionally conducted focus group, it allows you to get as much information as you can and use them in your protocol and collect information about them. Later on, you will be able to do publication or presentation when you are finishing the trial, because you collected data on those subjects. You will be able to present them and use them. And what you will, when you are going to do a focus group, you can add and remove some secondary endpoints. And typically, you may not thinking of some endpoint or do some exploratory endpoints. These are the things that you really can add, or inclusion exclusion criteria. There are so many components that you can add by doing focus group and learn what are the components that the end users would want to know. So you can incorporate them in your trial, and then even presenting them to the food and drug, the regulatory agencies. Another element that some sponsors take advantage of this concept, lately becoming more and more common, taking advantage of key opinion leaders. And having a discussion before, say, starting the study or even finishing the protocol, talking to key opinion leader allows you to know this is different than the end users. The key opinion leaders will tell you about what is going on at the moment in that particular field that you are going to do a trial. Obviously, who there are so many key opinion leaders. Some of them, they are ex-FDAers or regulators. They used to work with regulators, some academician. But if you are going to do that, use a key opinion leader with recent experience with regulatory. And that way you can get a better understanding when they are talking to you with respect to the topic. And one more thing that I would like to emphasize on, it is the key opinion leader, it is their opinion that matters, but it's your product. And typically, you know more about your product than anyone else's. They know about the class of that product, the indication, and things of that nature. But it is your product. The best approach that we learn when we are dealing with key opinion leader is to think about the questions that we have and then present the question to them if you are going to have more than one key opinion leader, which we do recommend that. And then present the questions to them and try to get the answer from them. They may give you so much opinion, so many different opinions, but focus on your questions. And when you get enough information about it, you move on and then go to the next question. Because for each question, maybe multiple answers. And based on the key opinion leaders, you may be able to modify your protocol and add to your primary endpoint using co-primary endpoints and things of that nature, add to your secondary endpoints, absolutely, or delete some of the secondary endpoints, and other things that you can take advantage of, meaning inclusion, exclusion criteria, schedule event, and things of that nature. But it is very, very good to be able to use the key opinion leaders. And if you are going to have a meeting with regulatory agency, it is best if you can take one of the knowledgeable of them with you when you are discussing, especially if a subject was discussed and or came up that you need to have some support when you are presenting it to regulatory agency. Endpoint, you heard me talking about endpoint multiple times, and or especially selecting of the endpoint is essential. Yeah, I think it was one of my colleagues when they were looking at pictures putting here, they decided to put one of the presentations I had long time back, only talking about endpoint. The primary endpoint is really related to the primary objective of the trial, but they are not the same. The primary endpoint is the way that you are measuring the success or failure of the trial. Primary endpoint is the one that you calculate the sample size, the power, and things of that nature. There are times that you may do a phase 2/3 adaptive clinical trial design. That means really you do have some data, but not enough. Therefore, you don't know if what you are going to make assumption about the primary endpoint is correct. In those cases, we recommend to do a simulation study. And using phase 1, phase 2 data is very common, but then using the simulation to confirm what you obtain from the early phase 1, phase 2 trial that you have. With respect to co-primary endpoints, this is different than having two primary endpoints. Co-primary endpoints, that means both of them have to be statistically significant. But two endpoints, it's different. You may be able to be statistically significant with one of them, but not with the second one. And there are some penalties, statistical penalty attached to it. if you use two primary endpoints, your alpha no longer is going to be 0.05, maybe 0.025, or coming up with a way to deal with this two endpoints. Otherwise, you have to pay some alpha for it, or coming up with a way of dealing with it. But co-primary endpoints, no. It is dictated by regulatory agency. And I do remember we conducted a trial, I think it was in hot flash reduction, and the primary endpoint was reduction in the frequency of hot flashes. The regulatory agency said, but no, you also have to look at the severity of hot flashes. You may reduce the hot flash from, let's say, 40 a week to 20 a week, but then those 20, the severity of them are so high that it didn't really pay that much to reduce the frequency. So the frequency and the severity are co-primary endpoints, and you need to be significant for both of them. Which it is very common these days that people use too many secondary endpoints, and we recommend that to don't use too many secondary endpoints. If you can, use limited number and try to find a way not to pay too much statistical penalty for those secondary endpoints. There are ways to do it, closed test procedure, hierarchy. There are different ways that you can use to not to pay too much a statistical penalty for your secondary endpoints. The other topic that I said is investigational product distribution. And the investigational product or the IP is one component that you should pay attention to it at the trial design stage, because especially if you are dealing with the adaptive trial design. Generally, in a double-blind randomized trial, the IP is managed by either the sponsor or a third party that, or depot, if you may. So with a mechanism, when the site uses some of the material in the site, then site will let the third party know that they need more of IP, and then the third party will send the IP there. And there are different, if you do by-site randomization or central randomization, that the IP management is different. But in adaptive trial design, due to the nature and the fact that the design of the trial in the middle of the trial will change, if that's the case, then the way that the IP was distributed to the sites may change as well. So you need to plan in advance how you are going to, let's assume the beginning of the start, you're going to have 3 arms: placebo, low dose, high dose. And then you do an interim analysis and you drop the non-effective dose. So now you are going to have placebo and, let's say, high dose. Now you have only 2 arms. So now that you are going to distribute the product, the IP, to the site, no longer you are going to have all 3 arms. All these have to be in the planning, and especially when you are thinking of adaptive trial design, how you are going to do IP distribution. Okay, these are the components that I mentioned about at the study, before the study design. And now let's talk about after study design. That is that really you have done all the thinking that you had, and now you are thinking of going to study design and thinking of about the clinical side. And in protocol, typically it depends. If you deal with CDRH, you have to tell them the maximum sites that you need to use, and this number of sites, it is specified. And usually we put as many as we can. Obviously, there are reasons for it. Sometimes a site claims that they can bring, I'm throwing a number, 5 patients per month, But when they start, they may not bring even one patient after 3 months. You may want to drop those sites if you can, but you should have a plan. How many sites you are going to have and how you are going to choose your sites. And as I said, if you specify as many sites as you could in your protocol, you may use all of them, you may use half of them, but always choose at least 10% more sites than you are going to use, because you don't know which of the sites you may end up dropping and not using. Having a good site selection plan that has a good criteria, you choose the criteria how you are going to choose your site. Obviously, talking to the sponsor, the cost may be one factor, but sites that bring more patients on board, it should be a good criteria to use. The reason is by having less sites, you will have less variability. Having less variability, you have more statistical power. And also by having more sites, in case if some sites are not performing well, you may want to drop those sites that are not performing well. Then another thing that I would like to emphasize is that, and we do that, don't let one site to have too many of your observations, more than, put a number, 15%. Just in case, for whatever reason, that site has to be dropped. If that site has to be dropped, it should not have too many of your patients there, because if a site, for whatever reason, may not be related to your trial, maybe to other trials, if regulatory decide that that site is not a valid site and you have to drop it and your trial is done already, you don't want to lose too many of your subjects. Still, you should have sufficient power to be able to claim your success, even by dropping that one site. If there is a site that is bringing more patients, the recommendation is go and audit that site before allowing that site to go and have more than the number of subjects that we were allowing them to have. And that way you will allow, you are more comfortable to select those, to be comfortable that the site that you are allowing to have more than a number of patients that you need being valid and no issue with that site at the end. I think I went too many slides. Let me go back one slide, make sure I'm in the right place. Yeah, I think I went. Let's see, where did I go? Okay, this is absolute stable sign. Now, we're talking about the sites. And so making sure that really the site that you are choosing are the right sites. And if they are going to bring too many patients, audit them before allowing to have more than 15, 20% of your patients. Patient recruitment plan. That is another one that really, after the trial start, you need to have that one in your hand, and how you are going to recruit. Usually we have recruitment specialist. Recruitment specialist is different than monitor. I know usually CRA, the clinical research monitors, really are the one doing the monitoring and helping you to do patient recruitment. We recommend to have a patient recruitment plan, because sometimes you may need to expedite it. Sometimes you may need to find a way to have a particular site to bring more patients on board. By planning ahead, actually, typically we say plan A, plan B, and plan Z. By doing it that way, you are not losing anything, because you don't know if, for example, after the trial starts, all of a sudden you learn that the plan was to have, I'm throwing a number, I don't know, 3 patients per site per month, and you have 10 sites, and you're thinking is you're gonna have 30 patients. Yes, first few months happen, but then after that, all of a sudden, you don't have anymore. You may have a patient recruitment plan that you may want to do advertisement, radio advertisement, or any way that you do advertisement. But having a plan, it is really, really essential, and it will help you. Big deal. Okay, now let's talk about adaptive trial design or mid-course adjustment. If you go back, I would say 20 years ago, or those of you who have been involved in conducting clinical trial for a long time, in the past, there was no way you can make any changes midstream of your clinical trial. But later on, as I said, about 10 years ago, there was discussion in the agency that to allowing people to do some modification as long as it is planned in advance. And but what is adaptive trial design? Adaptive trial design, it is a clinical trial that allows you to do some evaluation and mid of the trial. It can be middle of it. Say that you are going to have, I'm throwing a number, you have 3-arm study, placebo, low and high, and you are going to have 300 subjects. After 50% of subjects are on board, 150, you are going to do an interim analysis, and you may want to drop 1 arm. Or you may want to do an interim analysis and find out if 300 subjects will give you sufficient power at the end. So different factors you can start at the beginning. You can have 1-to-2 ratio, that means 1 placebo, 2 active, and then later on you make it 1-to-1 ratio. There are certain factors that you can adapt. Sample size being one, and very, very, very common, and dropping 1 arm is another one. There are certain factors, but you have to be aware of them, and there are pros and cons for any adaptive trial that you are going to do. And the question that should be used adaptive trial design or not, I would say absolutely yes. If you can design an adaptive trial design, a trial, the minimum to do sample size recalculation, it is really, really the best that you can do. Or if you have 4 arm, you may want to drop the lowest efficacious arm. And in the FDA, there are 3 centers, as you know: this Center for Biologics, Center for Drug, CDER, and CBER, and CDRH for medical devices. All of them will accept, but you need to discuss with them. Actually, the guidelines that I have here, if you look on the bottom of your screen, that you can download the latest guideline for adaptive trial design. And this one is based on CDER and CBER. But with CDRH, that is medical device, yes, they will accept it too, but you need to negotiate, you need to discuss with them. One of the problem that when you talk to the elder generation statistician, when you say that I'm going to do an interim analysis, immediately the question comes up, how about type 1 error? Are we losing? We have to reduce from 0.05 to 0.047 or whatever, paying some statistical penalty? The answer is, it's possible to do an adaptive trial design and still preserve the type 1 error. But again, you need to have it in advance, and you need to pre-specify the rules and have a discussion with the regulatory agency and specify it in your protocol in advance. And doing an adaptive trial design, it will allow you the possibility of either stopping the trial early or modifying it. By modification, I have to repeat myself. You are allowed to modify certain aspects of the trial, not all the factors. What are the defining characteristics of all adaptive trial design? It is pre-planned, and in advance you know what you are going to adapt. And the main characteristic of any adaptive trial design is taking advantage of observed data while the trial is ongoing. As I said in the past, that was not the case, but now, as I said at the beginning, that if you have 300 observation and then doing an interim analysis after 50%, that means you can take advantage of knowledge that you gain in this 150 for the remaining of the trial. And doing an adaptive trial design or adjusting, taking advantage of the knowledge that you learned during the trial, that is what you are going to do without creating any potential biases. And that's why you have to do it in advance. And doing and keeping the trial-wise type 1 error rate constant, not losing any, not paying any penalty. And again, the reason that you need to specify the factor that you're going to change, so the validity and the integrity of the clinical trial is protected. And another thing that you need to do and that's very, very common in any clinical, any adaptive trial design, is that those who are involved in the trial conduct should be less involved in the knowledge that are being gained from the interim analyses that you obtain. And as I said earlier, there are certain factors that you can modify in adaptive trial design. There are certain factors that you cannot. What is the major benefit of any adaptive trial design? The main benefit is really early characterization of the efficacy in particular and safety. For safety, really, you don't need to do adaptive trial design. You can do a trial without doing adaptive, but have a data safety monitoring that after every, I don't know, 20 patients or 50 patients or 25%, 50%, you establish a data safety review. It reviews the safety, and we may, if there is no safety issue, you can continue. But the adaptive trial design, the main benefit is that not only you can look at the safety. Okay. I think I went back. The more data that you have, the better we'll be able to have knowledge of the power and the successfulness of the drug or not. Main component of doing an adaptive trial design is to reduce the risk of late failure. That means that if you do an interim analysis, again, go back to that example that I gave with 300 subjects, after 150 subjects, you do an interim analysis to see if 300 subjects is sufficient for your trial or not. If you do an interim analysis after 150, you learn that really the power to finish the trial and achieve your success is only 5%. Which practically, you know, when we are designing a trial, we design it based on 80% power. After 150, you learn that really, this trial is going to fail. If that is the case, you are going to lose. If you had gone and got all 300 subjects. So after a year of the trial, you learn about it and you can stop it if you have to. Or rather than 300, you learn that you needed 340 subjects. So it is much benefit to do it and then adding 40 more subjects. Remember, you have to identify the penalty and all that thing. That way, when you finish your trial is successful. By doing it all this, really it is both more ethical, because rather than bringing 300 subjects on board and finding that the product is not working versus 150, so from ethical point of view, it is the right thing to do. And you will learn about it faster. And it is, if it is a trial that is going to fail at the end, you will learn about it a lot sooner. Therefore, you can stop the trial sooner rather than waiting a year and a half later. What are the main risks of an adaptive trial design? The main risk of adaptive trial design really is regulatory acceptance of that adaptive trial design. If you go and want to do an adaptive trial design that the regulatory agency may not agree with you to adapt a particular factor that you have in mind. And that's why I say that if you are going to do that, you have to present it to FDA or any regulatory agency and make sure that the integrity of your data is intact, the confidentiality is, the bias is you are not creating any biases. And when you are doing an adaptive trial design in advance, you need to talk about the statistical planning again in advance, on top of other things. Justification for sample size for the interim analyses. When you do an interim analysis, how you are going to add, or you cannot reduce the sample size, by the way. You can add to it, but you have to have that in advance. And I said earlier, you cannot change the primary endpoint, but you may want to change the randomization from 1:2 ratio to 1:1 ratio. These are the risks that you need to discuss and have it in advance, talking about it. The logistical issue is that, again, like the IP that I mentioned, the IP distribution, you need to know about it in advance. If you do not plan it in advance, it is a risk, because you change the ratio from 1:2 to 1:1, and now all of a sudden there is not enough IP, or the monitoring that you have it. These are the factors that you need to take into account before trial start, so you don't run into any major risk. I think I skipped one or two factors of the presentation that I have. Let me go back. This is the major benefit. No, I think I covered this. That's it. Yep. Okay, let me tell you what I told you with respect to adaptive trial design and all other factors. Let's start from the going from take-home message being create a regulatory strategy at the beginning when you are doing before you starting your trial. You need to have a very good regulatory strategy, and in many cases, doing regulatory discussion, you may or you may not need to have a regulatory meeting. Depends. If you are doing a trial that you have enough information about it, you don't need to have another pre-IND meeting with the agency. You need to have all the material that you need and present to the agency. Use all the non-data that you have in advance. As I said before starting the trial, you have that focus group. It allows you to get more than what you would have known to put in your protocol. You may collect, because typically people focus on what FDA needs from, or regulatory agencies need from approval. They don't take into account the end users, but you can collect some information that is going to help you quite a bit. With respect to number of sites, remember we say that it is good to have as many sites as you can, but reducing number of sites, it reduces the variability and increases the power and allows you more chance to have a successful trial. And also having more sites allows you to, if there are some non-performing sites, to get rid of them. With patient recruitment plan, not only patient recruitment plan, in some cases that recruiting patient is difficult, I would say having a patient recruitment specialist on your trial. That allows you to two things. One, recruiting patients and maintaining patients. It is extremely important. And the focus was from the beginning, we use the word adaptive, adaptive, adaptive. The answer is yes. Use of adaptive is always beneficial. And it helps, as I said earlier, it is both ethical and from economically, it is much, much beneficial. And as is Amarex since 2010, almost all clinical trials that we are doing are adaptive. And if we can do phase 1, phase 2/3, most often we do it. And there are times that people or sponsors prefer to do a large trial rather than as requirement being 80% power, they say they do it 90% power. The answer is, if you don't need to, why not going minimum 80% power, do an interim analysis, and then if it's required, then add more subject. So doing adaptive trial design, it is beneficial both from time and money and ethic. The main reason is because in many cases, when we design the trial at the beginning, really the data that we have, even if it is from our own phase 2 trial, in many cases is from the historical data, we don't know if practice of medicine has changed since the time that data was collected. But being able to use the ongoing data, the actual data that you have, and adjust it while the trial is ongoing, it is a lot more powerful than if you are using the past data. And also, it helps patients access to the clinical product faster. How that is going to happen? Because if you do an adaptive trial design and you are doing a 3-arm study, as I mentioned at the beginning, and you'll learn that low dose or whatever is not efficacious, you drop it. You're going to focus on lesser number of hours. That means lesser number of subjects, and you're going to achieve your goal a lot faster. Thank you very much.